Good. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. We'll start the program with recitation of Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إذا السماء انشقت وأذنت لربها وهقت وإذا الأرض مدت وألقت ما فيها وتخلت وأذنت لربها وهقت يا أيها الإنسان إنك كادح إلى ربك كدحا فملاقيه فأما من أوتي كتابه بيمينه فسوف يحاسب حسابا يسيرا وينقلب إلى أهله مسرورا وأما من أوتي كتابه وراء ظهره فسوف يدعو ثبورا ويصلى سعيرا إنه كان في أهله مسرورا إنه ظن أن لن يحور بلى إن ربه كان به بصيرا فلا أقسم بالشفق والليل وما وسق والقمر إذا اتسق لتركبن طبقا عن طبق والليل وما وسق والقمر إذا اتسق لتركبن طبقا عن طبق فما لهم لا يؤمنون وإذا قرئ عليهم قرآن لا يسجدون بل الذين كفروا يكذبون والله أعلم بما يوعون فبشرهم عذاب عليم إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات لهم أجر غير ممنون صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Thank you very much for that beautiful recitation. We're now going to move to the main part of the program, which is a talk by Ammar Asaria on the Islamic proofs for the existence of God. Let's welcome Salat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Ammar is a regular member of the community who has studied this topic and would like to talk about it today.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Thank you all for joining us. This was put together a bit in the last minute, so I apologize for not going into as much detail as I would have liked to, but inshallah we can provide a good overview of a few of the proofs that some of our scholars have put forward in the past. So when I was thinking about what to talk about, I didn't think for very long, but when I came up with this topic, I was thinking one of the things that I see quite regularly is a lot of atheists putting forward what they say are very rational arguments for why there is no reason to believe in God. Most atheists don't say that God doesn't exist. They just say you can't prove that God exists. And so they say there's no reason to believe in something that we don't know if it exists or not. And what appears to have happened is that the rational position appears to be the position that we can't tell if there is a God or not, whilst the irrational position is to assert that there is a God. Now, this is completely in opposition to what scholars in our past used to believe, right? So they would have always believed that the rational position is that there is a God. And so I'm hoping to bring out some of those proofs and show how they used to say that. So I guess the first question that I have for all of you is, do you have certainty in your belief of God? Right, so just very quickly, a show of hands. Who here can say that they most certainly believe that there is a God? Yeah, that's good, the majority of you, okay. And who here would be able to tell me why they could say that they believe there is a God? Okay. We have one person, all right, okay, alhamdulillah. A few people say they could tell me why they would believe in a God, right? So very often, we don't actually teach the proofs of God, but these were very central to our Islamic philosophy. So in Islamic philosophy, we have what we call metaphysics. And so when Aristotle was initially putting forward his philosophical work, he defined something called metaphysics. And in this metaphysics, he talks about showing that there is existence, okay? Showing that there is being. And in this, he doesn't actually put his proof for God in the metaphysics, he puts it in his physics, but he puts forward a proof of God. And later on, this proof of God is moved into the category of metaphysics. And this is actually one of the most important things, because what the metaphysics does is it creates a foundation for how you view everything else in existence. So if you don't have a solid foundation upon which how you view everything else, then the actual understanding of everything else becomes very difficult. And one of the things that happens with the advent of modernity is that the very foundations on which we begin to understand the world change. We move away from a position in which the existence of God is something that's obvious to where we can actually question the existence of God. And so in this country, the majority of people believe now that they don't claim to have a religion. And so we have these shifts taking place because the very foundations upon which we think have shifted. So inshallah, when I put forward this proof for Allah, we'll see how it creates an idea of what Allah is that is something that's quite amazing, that's something that's quite deep, that helps us to understand Allah. Right, so just skipping over that, I'm going to begin with a quick overview on how Islamic philosophy develops. All right, so in 632, Christian era, Prophet Muhammad passes away. So when Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he passes away, we have in the works of people like Imam Ali, the beginnings of a philosophical outlook. And if you read something like his Nahjul Balagha, you can see there is very clearly some very deep understandings of what Allah is. And this stuff begins to get pulled out later into philosophical theories. Our development then begins with the Mu'tazili and the Ash'aris. So they put forward theological theories around 750 CE, so we're talking about 120, 130 years after the death of the Prophet. And this is the same time as Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq is around. And Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq is also, so when you read hadith from him, you can also see that these kind of things are being developed, these theological theories are all there, or are at least beginning to start to appear in those works. But they don't at this time put forward a proof for the existence of God. So the theologians don't put forward a proof for the existence of God. They do a lot of other very interesting discussions. So they discuss things like, what do the attributes of Allah mean? So if we say that Allah is all-powerful, what does that mean? If we say that Allah is good, can we say that Allah is good? And what does that very meaning of goodness even mean? So the Mu'tazilis and the Ash'aris start debating these topics. They put forward a lot of ideas on this. And the Mu'tazili thought is taken quite heavily by the first Islamic philosopher, which is Al-Kindi. And Al-Kindi, in around 870 CE, he begins to take the work of the Greek philosophers and combine it with the theological work and begin to create a more systematic outlook on the entirety of philosophy. But at this point, it's still quite early stage. It's not fully thought out. And Al-Farabi comes along and he joins Aristotle's thought to this quite heavily. Now, the works that come to the Muslims, we have works from Plato coming to the Muslims. Very few of Plato's actual full works were translated into Arabic. So the works of Plato actually come from later summaries of him that were put together, and then those have been translated into Arabic. We have almost the entirety of Aristotle's work translated into Arabic. And interestingly, one of Plotinus's works, so Plotinus is a much later philosopher. He's a very spiritual philosopher. He puts together an idea of what God is that is very much in line with how the Sufis think of Allah. And that work, one of Plotinus's works, the Enneads, part of it gets translated into Arabic, and it gets translated under the title of Theology of Aristotle. So something very interesting happens here. This work is confused as being Aristotle's work. And because of this confusion, Aristotle's work is changed in the Muslim world into something quite different because it gets combined with this work of Plotinus that's quite spiritual in nature. So the philosophy that the Muslims have is not the same sort of more materialistic philosophy that Aristotle puts forward. It's a more spiritual philosophy, because Plotinus believed that the purpose of philosophy was to give us an understanding of what Allah is, to help us to actually reach Allah himself, to actually have a spiritual vision of Allah. So the whole purpose of philosophy is to allow us to have this spiritual vision of Allah. And this gets combined very heavily with Aristotle's work, beginning with Al-Kindi. Beginning with Al-Farabi. And then we have the person that is probably the most important Islamic philosopher, and maybe even the most important philosopher of all time after Plato and Aristotle, Ibn Sina. So Ibn Sina puts forward a proof for the existence of God. He takes Aristotle's work, he combines it with this theology of Aristotle that he thinks is Aristotle's work, and he creates a whole coherent philosophy, and probably one of the most amazing Islamic philosophical works that we have. He writes extensively, and the proof that we're going to be looking at today is going to be his proof. And all philosophy and theology after Ibn Sina is taking into account Ibn Sina's work. So when Ghazali, he writes his work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, the main person he's talking about is Ibn Sina. He's saying that Ibn Sina's work was incoherent. There were big problems with it. There were big issues with it. But when Al-Ghazali does this, he transforms the entirety of Ash'ari theology to become an Aristotelian work now. It now is very tightly entwined with Aristotelian logic. So all theology after that is actually a work of philosophy. Okay? So when we have this very modern view that Islamic thought died with Al-Ghazali, we don't have any rational work after that, that makes the assumption that philosophy dies because this thing called falsafa dies. Yes, but falsafa is not all of Islamic philosophy. Islamic philosophy gets integrated into kalam, and kalam continues to thrive in the centuries after Ghazali, and there are massive developments on kalam. We have we have huge works on logic that come out after this. We have extensions of what logic is, very different to what modern logic is, but extensions of Aristotelian logic. And these works are hugely influential. Ibn Arabi, who was on here but seems to have been cut off. Ibn Arabi comes a little bit after Al-Ghazali as well, and he puts together a work on I would call it very much a philosophical work. It's a metaphysical work where it talks about God, what God is, why he exists, how he exists. It talks about the names of Allah, and it begins to put all of these in understandable ways. And with Ibn Arabi, we have the combination of philosophy and Irfani works. So these things get combined together. Ibn Rushd does something very interesting. Ibn Rushd takes Ibn Sina's work, and he tries to remove the Plotinus parts of it. He tries to remove this theology of Aristotle from it and make it more pure Aristotelian work. But nobody in the Muslim world really takes Ibn Rushd's work seriously. So Ibn Rushd's works in the Muslim world has very little influence. But in the Christian world, this has a massive influence. So Ibn Rushd, so when someone like Aquinas comes along a bit later, he has Ibn Rushd's work translated into Latin, and he refers to the commentator, and the commentator is Ibn Rushd, because this is the person who has written the most extensive commentaries on Aristotle's work. And then so Ibn Rushd's work and Ibn Sina's work form the basis of what Aquinas' Summa Theologica is, right? We then have people like Suhrawardi coming afterwards. He comes around the same time as Ibn Arabi, and Suhrawardi also puts forward a very interesting, much closer to Plotinus's work without the combinations of Aristotle in it. And this is quite important because he creates what's known as the Illuminationist philosophy, and this is taken by Mullah Sadra a little bit later. And Mullah Sadra then combines everything together. He combines philosophy, he combines theology, he combines Irfan, he combines Aristotle's work, he combines this all together and creates what is probably, in the Shia world, the greatest piece of philosophical work that we have. Now, Mullah Sadra has been developed on, and is still developed on, in the Iranian world today, and he forms the basis of what is our main philosophy. We don't have the time today to look at Mullah Sadra's work, but it's important for us to understand that Islamic thought never died. Islamic thought continued happening. There were hugely influential philosophers who come about after Al-Ghazali, and up to very recently, we still have a lot of very interesting thinkers. So I want to begin in a slightly non-time-based order. So I want to begin with the argument for the existence of God that Ghazali puts forward. So this is known as, more recently it's become known as the Kalam cosmological argument. So there is a Christian thinker, Christian philosopher, his name is William Lane Craig. And William Lane Craig has taken this argument from Ghazali, and he's kind of modernized it so that we would understand it now. And he's created some very interesting videos on it. So I thought I would just play you one of the videos that explains this Kalam cosmological argument. But I'm going to play to you part 2 of it, because part 1 is a little bit basic and I can explain it quite quickly. So part 1, he basically states that this is the argument that Ghazali puts forward. Everything that begins to exist has a cause, okay? The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe must have a cause. Very simple. So if the universe has a cause, then what is the cause for that universe? Okay? That cause itself cannot be something that has a cause. Because if it has a cause, then we continue to go backwards. Well, what was the cause of that? And as this video is about to explain, an infinite regress is not possible. It doesn't make sense. We couldn't possibly exist today if there was an infinite regress. So there has to be something that caused the universe that itself does not have a cause, and that thing has to be what we define to be God. And William Lane Craig has a very Protestant understanding of what God is, but he says it's a personal creator. When Protestants think of God, they think of something very different to what we think of God. They think of something that's very personal, and they believe of this thing in three forms. So William Lane Craig gives the example of God being a little bit like the Greek mythological dog. What was the name? The one with three heads. Kerberos, yes. So a bit like Kerberos. It's this one entity that has three distinct parts. That's what William Lane Craig thinks of God. But this argument doesn't in any way talk about what that God is, but only that there is a God that exists. So if I could ask Sajjad to play this video, we can see what William Lane Craig puts forward as the argument.
Did the universe have a beginning? Or has it existed from eternity past? If it did have a beginning, this raises a question. Did the universe have a creator? In part 1, we explored this question scientifically. Now let's look at it philosophically. Aristotle believed the universe was eternal in the past, but Al-Ghazali disagreed. He pointed out that if the universe did not have a beginning, then the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But that's a problem, because the existence of an actually infinite number of past events leads to absurdity. It's metaphysically impossible. Why? The mathematician David Hilbert illustrates the problem by imagining a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, all of which are occupied. There's not a single vacancy. Every room in the infinite hotel is full. Now suppose a new guest shows up and asks for a room. The manager says, sure, no problem, then moves the guest who was in room number 1 to room number 2, and the guest who was in room number 2 to room number 3, and so on to infinity. As a result of this shuffling, room number 1 becomes vacant, and the new guest happily checks in, even though all the rooms were already full, and nobody has checked out. And it gets even more absurd. Suppose an infinity of new guests show up at the front desk. No problem, says the manager. Then she moves each person into a room with a number twice that of his own room. So the person who was in room number 1 moves into room number 2. The person who was in 2 moves to 4. The person who was in 3 moves to 6, and so on. Since any number multiplied by 2 is always an even number, all the odd-numbered rooms become vacant, and the infinity of new guests gratefully check in. And yet, before they arrived, all the rooms were already full. It gets even crazier when the guests start to check out. Suppose all the guests in the odd-numbered rooms check out. In that case, an infinite number of people have left the hotel. And yet, there are no fewer people in the hotel. But suppose instead, all the guests in rooms numbered 4 and above check out. In that case, only 3 people are left. And yet exactly the same number of people left the hotel this time as when all the odd-numbered guests checked out. Thus we have a contradiction. We subtract identical quantities from identical quantities and get different answers. These absurdities show that an actually infinite number of things cannot exist in the real world. Here is a second argument Ghazali offers against a past eternal universe. Suppose that for every 1 orbit Saturn completes around the Sun, Jupiter completes 2. The longer they orbit, the further Saturn falls behind. Now, what if these 2 planets have always been orbiting the Sun from eternity past? Which has completed the most orbits? Strangely enough, the number of their orbits is exactly the same, infinity. But that seems absurd, for the longer they orbit, the greater the difference becomes. If the universe has always existed, then an infinite series of past events has been formed by adding one event after another. It's like a sequence of dominoes, falling one after another until the last domino, today, is reached. The problem is that the final domino could never fall if an infinite number of dominoes had to fall first. So today could never be reached. But obviously, here we are. It's today. So the number of events leading up to today could not possibly be infinite. The infinite is nowhere to be found
In reality, it neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play
is solely that of an idea. What objections might be raised to these arguments? Some people object that, unlike the rooms in Hilbert's hotel, the events of the past don't all exist at the same time. But we can easily tweak the story to get rid of this objection. Suppose the hotel has been under construction from eternity past, one room being added each year. How many rooms would there now be in the hotel? An actual infinite number. So if the past is infinite, that would imply that Hilbert's hotel could exist, which is absurd. Others have objected that an actually infinite number of things do exist, namely numbers and other mathematical entities. However, this objection presupposes that numbers really exist, but this is a highly disputed assumption that most philosophers reject. So if Ghazali's two arguments are right, then the universe is not eternal in the past. It must have a beginning. And we know intuitively that whatever begins to exist requires a cause of its existence. Thus, we are led to conclude that the universe has a cause of its existence. So what caused the universe? Atheist Daniel Dennett says, the universe caused itself. But this is incoherent, because in order to cause itself to come into existence, the universe would have to exist before it existed. The cause of the universe must therefore be outside of the universe, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and enormously powerful. Much like God.
Okay, so there he tries to defend the Ghazalian proof for the existence of God, right? So we have this notion of this infinite regress and an infinite regress being impossible. I'm not sure that that argument fully works. I think personally that if you have an infinite regress of time and you don't have a single existence of an infinity, then maybe that infinity is possible to exist. But this is the argument that he's put forward, and I think that the objection and what his response to it doesn't necessarily work. So I think that a much stronger argument for the existence of God comes from Ibn Sina. And this argument is a much more philosophical argument. So I will need to stand up and write on a whiteboard. Ibn Sina begins his argument for the existence of God slightly differently. Let me bring this forward. So Ibn Sina begins his argument for the existence of God by first defining the term cause. So Aristotle has this notion of cause where we have 4 different types of causes for an object, but we're not going to go into the details of Aristotle's notion of cause. But what we do need to understand is that when Ibn Sina talks about a cause, he doesn't think of it as something that precedes an event in time. So in Ghazali's proof for the existence of God, he talks about us existing just now. So I'm here. I'm here because my parents gave birth to me. They're here because their parents gave birth to them, and so on. But once my parents cease to exist, I still continue to exist. So I'm not reliant on their existence. So Ibn Sina says this isn't what we mean by the term cause. He says a cause has to be something that exists at the same time and is sustaining that thing and making it continue to exist for it to actually be a cause. So let's give an example of this. I'm holding a pen, okay? And I move this pen to the side. Now, this pen is moving to the side. And instantaneously, as this pen is moving to the side, my hand is moving with it, right? So my hand is causing this pen to move to the side. It's happening at the same time. But not only is it happening at the same time, what is allowing my hand to push this? So my hand itself has a whole series of causes. So firstly, we could argue that there's a cause of my hand making contact with this pen. So there's a whole bunch of forces and things that take place that allow me to push this pen to the side. There's a set of things happening inside my body at this very moment. So my cells need to be creating energy to allow my muscles to contract. My muscles need to contract. All of these things are happening at exactly the same thing. And there are loads of these things that are happening. Many, many, many of them that are happening at the same time just to allow me to push this pen to the side. So all of these causes, the causes of this, the causes that are making this pen move to the side are all instantaneous. They're happening at the same time. Let's take another example. Imagine somebody builds a house, okay? When they build this house, doors and windows, when they build this house, the builders go away. So in Ghazali's concept of a cause, we would have said that the builders were the cause of this house. But once they've left, this house continues to stand. So Ibn Sina would say, no, the cause of this house is not the builders. The cause of this house are the things that are sustaining it and allowing it to continue to stand at this very moment. So what's allowing it to stand at this moment? So the materials that it's made of, the forces interacting between those materials, the things that hold the atoms in existence, the forces between the atoms, and so on and so on. These things are allowing this house to continue to exist. What tends to happen in modern philosophy is that we say that things, that specifically we say that these foundational material, we used to say atoms, now we say that atoms are made of other things. So we say whatever the things that is the base material of everything, that thing exists and it continues to exist on its own. But this isn't an obvious thing to happen. Why should something continue to exist? Right? And Ibn Sina asks this very question. He asks, why should something continue to exist? Before he goes into listing out the existences, he defines two types of causes. Okay? So we have two types of causes. We have a cause that is contingent. Okay? And by contingent, we mean dependent on something else. So it's caused by something else. So we have a type of cause that is caused by something else. All right? And we have a second type of cause. That's a cause that's not caused by anything else. So it is its own cause, or it sustains itself. And we call those type of objects necessary. Is that how you spell necessary? I don't know. However you spell necessary. So we have contingent causes and necessary causes. So Ibn Sina splits these types of causes into two. He says, all right, we don't know if in this world there are any necessary causes. He says, that's what we want to prove. We want to prove if there is a necessary cause, or if actually causes can just be contingent, if all causes are contingent. So he says, let's start with a premise. Let's start with agreeing on one thing. And that one thing is that something exists. Okay? I think we can all agree that something exists. Okay? And Ibn Sina asked the question, what causes this something? So not the cause in the sense of something that precedes it and makes it, but what is causing it at this moment to be there? Right? So if we take the example of myself, I am at this moment being caused by my body. Right? So I have a physical body. All right, so we have cause number one. my body itself is caused by the cells that it is made of. So we have cause number 2. I should do them the other way around. So this is causing this. This is causing this. Now, the cells are constructed of atoms. So we have cause number 3. And he goes on. Let's say that all of these are contingent. And he says, let's make a list of every single possible contingent cause that we can think of. Okay? Let's make a list of everything. So he says, we create a set over here. And this set is the set of all contingent causes. Okay? Right? And Ibn Sina says, if you want, there can be infinite elements in here. So we can go all the way to see infinity. Okay? He says, no problem. If you don't want, if you want a limited number of causes, you can have a limited number of causes. All right. And he asks, okay, all of these things are contingent. So all of them must themselves have a cause. So what are our options for what we could say? We can either say that all of these things are caused by an element inside this set. So we could say everything is caused by one of the causes. But does this work? Wait a minute. If we say it's caused by one of these causes and it itself is contingent, then that means that it has a cause. So we can't say that it's caused by something in the set. So whatever we say caused this has to be outside of this set. So he says, all right, let's assume that there's a contingent cause outside of this set. But wait a minute. This is a set of all contingent causes. So if there's something contingent outside of this set, well, actually it belongs in this set because we've already listed all contingent causes. So there has to be something outside this set that is itself not contingent. The only way for anything to exist at this moment, so for something to be sustained in existence, is for there to be a necessary cause. So this thing must be a necessary cause. How do you spell necessary? A-R-Y, is that right? All right. So there must be a necessary cause that is causing all of these contingent causes. If there isn't, then these things cannot be in existence, right? Because we just have contingent things, and they can't possibly be contingent things that cause contingent things, because that contingent thing itself has a cause. So there must be a necessary cause. Now, Ibn Sina says, we don't know what this necessary cause is. Yeah? We don't know yet what this necessary cause is. So let's think about this necessary cause, and let's begin to see what features it has. So we are now sure that there has to be a necessary cause. And he asked the first question. Is it possible for this necessary cause to come into existence? Well, no. If it comes into existence, that would mean that it is itself caused. So it must have always existed. So this necessary cause, we can say about it, has always existed. All right? Can this necessary cause have parts? So Ibn Sina asks, is it possible for this necessary cause to have parts? Could it be something that's constructed of other things? Well, wait a minute. If it has a part, then it itself is being caused by the part. And that would mean that the part is what's necessary, not the total. So the necessary cause itself has to be partless. It cannot have any parts whatsoever. So partless. So we've now got this necessary cause has always existed. It's completely partless. Then Ibn Sina asked the question, is it possible for there to be two of these? Could we have two necessary causes? So this is a partless entity, and we now have two of it. So he says, okay, wait a minute. If we have two of these things, what's going to differentiate the first one from the second one? For there to be something that differentiates it, it would have to have a part, because only parts are things that can differentiate one thing from another thing. So this partless entity, there can only be one of them. Multiple would not make sense because they would be identical. So some people ask, could you not have this identical thing in two different spaces? Well, if this thing exists in space, then space itself is a requirement for its existence. That means that it has a cause. So it cannot itself even exist in space. So there must be one of them, and it must be an incorporeal body. It must be something that is not physical. Right? So we have this thing that's very much beginning to look like the God that we worship. It's eternal. It's partless. There's only one of them. It's not physical. So Ibn Sina has, from this proof, managed to construct this notion of what this God is and shown it to be very similar to the God that we believe in. Oh, my translation's gone. But anyway, so Surah Ikhlas, we have قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Right? So Ibn Sina does very specifically brings Surah Ikhlas, and he says, let's see if the existence that we're talking about is the same existence as what the Quran is talking about. So, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. There, say He, Allah, is one. Okay? So we've got this one God. Allahu Samad. Now this word Samad is quite a difficult word to translate. A lot of translators translate it as eternal. There are other translators who translate it as different things. But Samad itself, the word, has this meaning of something that is complete, something that doesn't have any gaps, doesn't have any holes. Right? So when we're talking about Allah, we are talking about this partless entity that sustains itself. And this is the notion of Samad. Okay? We then have Lam Yalid wa Lam Yulad. He doesn't beget, nor was he begotten. So this one thing has always existed. It was not created, nor can it create something that is like it. Because anything it creates has to be different from itself. Because this thing that's partless, if it was to create something that was identical to itself, well, that would itself be itself. I mean, there's no way to distinguish it from it. So everything it creates has to be different from itself. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. And no one is comparable to him. And nobody is comparable to this one entity that we have here coming out of this proof. Now, this proof says something very interesting as well. It says that every moment that we are existing, we can only continue to exist if Allah continues to allow us to exist. He has to continue causing us for us to be able to exist. So every moment of our life, Allah is the entity that is allowing us to exist. He becomes something that is necessary in the here and now, right? He doesn't become this abstract entity that does this creation at one point and disappears. No. Allah cannot disappear. Allah has to be there at every moment to continue to sustain us in existence. And this is what comes out from Ibn Sina's proof. Now there's a lot more that can be said here, and there are some interesting conclusions that he comes up with. So one thing that he comes up with, he says that in terms of the creation has to be eternal. He says even the creation itself has to also be eternal, but it is constantly being caused by Allah, which makes it created, right? So in the Quran we have constant reference to Allah created the heavens and the earth. So this notion of Allah creating the heavens and the earth, he says, okay, that doesn't mean that it was created in time. He says it was created outside of time. It always existed, the creation, and it will continue to always exist. So yes, this I find is one of the most interesting proofs for the existence of God that comes out from our Islamic philosophy. And actually, I find that, if I move this to the side, I'll take a seat again. So when we talk about the existence of this creation, Ibn Sina gives us a reason to believe that this creation is there. He gives us a reason to understand that this creation is very similar to what the Quran describes God as being as. And what happens is we have a very rational proof for the existence of God. And we move away from saying that God is this thing that we just have to believe in. But actually, no, we can show that there is this thing that we should continue to believe in. And we move away from having this notion that God doesn't affect our lives, because He is affecting our lives. He is causing us to live in every moment that we exist. So, just a few more things to say on this. So this proof is then actually taken further. It's developed in the Christian world. So Aquinas has a very similar proof for the existence of God. Aquinas puts forward what's known as the 5 proofs of God. One of the proofs is very similar to this, but he changes it slightly to have the he says that you can't have an infinite number of causes, so there must be a necessary cause. He doesn't use the set theory that Ibn Sina uses. I think that the set theory that Ibn Sina uses, it doesn't require you to say that you can't have an infinite regress, so you could have an infinite regress and it still works, which makes it much harder to counter. And actually, I haven't seen any good counters to this argument. I have looked quite extensively for people to put arguments against this, but I haven't seen much. And especially when you have these popular atheists, people like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, whoever the other ones are, they don't really get into the nitty-gritties of philosophy. So Richard Dawkins repeatedly uses the cosmological argument. He'll put it forward, and then he'll say, yeah, but there's no reason for us to believe that that first cause should be anything other than a natural cause. But Ibn Sina's argument gives us a reason why that first cause has to be something very different to what's in material existence. I will leave it there, and if there are any questions, then I'm happy to take them. Salawat.
Thank you very much, Ammar, for that very interesting talk. Do we have any questions from either the sisters or the brothers' side?
Thank you, Ammar. You're showing some signs of your dad. But have you had a chance to look at Allama Iqbal's reconstruction of religious thought in Islam? I think in 1 or 2 of those lectures, he goes into this question of the existence of God. I don't know if you have looked at it.
So I did look at the reconstruction of religious thought a long time ago. Allama Iqbal's work is interesting, specifically his reconstruction, because at least when I read it, my reading of it was that he gives a whole bunch of arguments, and he takes a Bergsonian view on the existence of God. But he gives a whole bunch of arguments, and then he ends by saying that all we need is ijtihad, which I found very strange. But yeah, no, I mean, he does put forward a few proofs for the existence of God. I think that he falls into the trap of taking postmodernist thinkers very seriously. I'm not a fan of postmodernist thinkers, and so I think he makes a big mistake. I think that they essentially, when you take their thought further, it leads to nihilism. It leads to belief in nothing. And so I think if you take what he says there further, it can also lead to nihilism. Whilst I think that the thinking of our classical philosophers doesn't allow for that, and mainly because they're grounded in people like Plato. I think that grounding in Plato is incredibly important.
One from the sister side.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
How would you explain children God is existing? I find it very complicated myself.
Okay.
So how would I explain my children?
So that is something I've been thinking about recently. I think initially, you just have to talk about the beauty that you see in the world and where has that beauty come from. So the Quran repeatedly gives us this kind of indication towards the existence of God, right? It repeatedly talks about these are the signs of Allah. So do you not believe? It repeatedly has these kind of things. And I think that is the way that we teach our children, right? We point out the beauty that exists in the world and say, look, where could this have come from other than from Allah? And then, as they begin to develop, as they begin to get older, I think that you have to put forward proofs of existence of God like this. I don't think you did have to in the past, but I think now, in the current society, the way that thought is constructed, it doesn't allow you to naturally see the existence of God. The kind of logic that we develop doesn't allow us to naturally see an existence of God. And so to overcome that, I think you have to put forward this. I have presented this argument at madrasa several times to 12, 13-year-olds, and they are fully able to grasp it. So I think this is possible to explain to people once they get to around the age of 12, 13.
Thanks, Ammar. So I must say I really like the Ibn Sina proof. I haven't seen this before. The cosmological argument seems to me to have a big weakness because you can easily say, well, what's the cause of the universe? It must be God. Well, what's the cause of God? Like, how did God come into existence? Is there a good answer to that question?
Sajjad, could I just ask you to bring the slides back up? So the cosmological argument, so that is the common argument that's put forward by the atheists, especially the popular atheists. But we have to be careful. The first premise of this argument is everything that begins to exist has a cause. And that key word there, begins to exist. So the universe begins to exist, so it must have a cause that does not begin to exist. So the cause of it has to be something that doesn't begin to exist. And
so can I say one thing?
Yeah.
So basically, when you say begins, then it needs a trigger. So when you say begins, it needs a trigger, and that's the key thing.
Yeah.
So the trigger, then you go. Then when we talk about necessary cause or necessary to exist or necessary being, necessary existence, this is where it doesn't need a trigger, so it doesn't need a beginning. It's always there.
Yeah, so it has to be something that doesn't begin to exist. There are some thinkers, so St. Anselm, for example, he takes this further and he tries to use this argument to bring out the characteristics of God as well. So that's an interesting thing to look at. I can't remember the full way that he does it off the top of my head, but it's worth looking at something like St. Anselm's cosmological argument for that.
Yeah, because I think the way the scientists have got around this issue is they've said, well, the universe has always existed, and there's this thing about Big Bang, and then, what is it, Big Shrink, and then it just restarts.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, this is the difficulty, isn't it? If we have a circular argument, then there can be another circular argument.
So with Ibn Sina's argument, so even if you were to say that it has this Big Bang followed by the Big Crunch, followed by the Big Bang, followed by the Big Crunch, that's perfectly coherent with Ibn Sina's argument. No problem. You can say that. That doesn't solve the issue of what at this very moment is the end of that line of causation.
Time for one final question.
If not that I object that there's the existence of Allah, but couldn't Ibn Sina's method be proved wrong via what they said, the Big Bang, but then couldn't there be something that has to trigger the Big Bang? Couldn't they just say, well, there was universal space and matter that triggered the Big Bang, and so go on. But in the end, couldn't they just say, well, in that case, there's nothing to start it. It just started itself, as you said. But wouldn't they be able to have a questioning of how it started? Like, let's say the first space matter is born, the first atom is born, nothing has triggered that, right? It was whatever. And they don't go past that point, right?
So, okay, very good question. Right, so you can put that argument forward for the normal cosmological argument, but it doesn't so much work with Ibn Sina's argument, because Ibn Sina's argument, he doesn't talk about causation in a time-based sense, right? So he doesn't say that this object has a cause that precedes it in time. When he talks about causes, he's talking about what makes something the way that it is just now, the way that it is, right? So what's making this table stay this way at this very moment, right? So when you talk about a non-time-based line of causation, then you can't just say that, well, it's always been this way. Well, it hasn't always been this way. Something's making it this way at this moment, right? We know there are a series of causes that causes it to be as it is.
Couldn't they just say that, okay, so the first atom's born,
right? So
whatever triggered that was just space, nothing.
Good. All right, excellent. So one of the objections that is put forward to the initial part of this argument is that, can we not say that material always existed, right? So let's say that material always existed. That doesn't require a cause, right? Then everything else can be built with that material. Good. That's an excellent objection that's put forward. Right, but there is an issue with this objection. That gives this material a godlike property. That basically says that material has the property to sustain itself. It has the ability to cause itself. Well, why should it have this ability? What makes it different to any other contingent cause? Material itself, what makes it different to anything else that's contingent? So Ibn Sina would say, no, material itself has to have a cause that allows it to continue to be sustained.
Basically. So once you go, because material is material, it's basic raw material, basic material. But then when you look at how everything being designed, then we could go simpler than this argument, all about design, intelligent of design. So, but it's very interesting.
Yeah. So so the design argument can be put forward. The design argument has weaknesses in terms of. I think evolution puts forward a different line to what can allow the design argument to work. But again, I think the material argument, I actually think materialism is an irrational belief, right? To say that material has the ability to sustain itself is very difficult to understand. All right, I won't say more. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a reminder for tomorrow's program, we begin at 5:45 with Salah, followed by a talk by Dr. Zahir Ismail, and then Amal for 15th Shaban, led by Dr. Muhammad Asaria. Inshallah, we'll finish around 8 p.m. with Ziyara. Thanks, Ammar, again.
Salwat.